today's moderator, Dr. Suzanne Minton. Suzanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Robin, and thanks to RAPS for hosting us today. We would like to welcome you to this presentation, and I'll introduce our speaker for today. It's Ms. Rachel Bombara. Rachel is currently a regulatory services manager at Certara Synchrogenics. She has more than a decade of experience in regulatory operations and helping sponsors achieve their eCTD submission goals. At Certara, Rachel leads and manages the submission of a variety of application types for different regions. Welcome to the event, Rachel. I'll now turn it over to you to begin the presentation.
Hello, everyone. I'll get started here by sharing my screen, of course. All right, so thank you for that introduction, Suzanne, and very happy to be here. And I'm going to be your guide through the presentation today of Oops, I Messed Up, How to Avoid and Fix Common Regulatory Submission Mistakes. So let's get started. All right, as an overview today, I'm going to discuss common EC submission mistakes, the best practices for avoiding those mistakes in the first place, and also what to do if a mistake or omission occurred, because we know these things happen. So let's start with the basics. Why do we want to avoid mistakes? Well, there's the obvious. We want to get it right the first time and avoid spending extra time and money, whether it's for ourselves, our team, our company. But another reason is that once a submission is sent and received by a health authority, any errors are much harder to fix. And normally they can only be amended by a follow-up sequence, which is really a bandage on the issue. Better avoided in the first place. But can all mistakes be avoided? No, we're human, things happen. And even if we have the most proactive measures in place, it's possible during our careers, we might inherit a much older application where there's some issues. So it just can't always be avoided. So let's start off with one of the most common areas where submission mistakes can happen. And this can be with FDA forms. So for all US submissions, these FDA forms are included, and there could be lots of little things that can happen. An older expired version of a form can be used, form might be dated incorrectly, or maybe the wrong forms used, or even just fully missed. So one of the ways to avoid this, especially with the expiration dates, is to check in the upper right corner what the expiration date is, as well as the footer shows the date it was issued. And be very careful when saving these to your desktop. There's lots of us that might try to save them to our desktop so we can fill it out quicker and reuse it for each sequence. So it can be a time saver, but when it's saved locally, it's possible to miss when FDA releases a new form in an updated version. So highly recommend checking FDA's website for the latest to make sure you're using the most recent up-to-date version of these forms, or at least check it regularly to make sure you don't miss an update. But also check that the correct smart form's being used for the submission type. So some of us may have been used to submitting say a 356H for annual reports, marketing applications, but now there's a new 2252 form that's included. So make sure you're checking regularly for any updates like that. Make sure the right form, the most up-to-date, is included. But what happens if it got missed and there was an issue with the form? Well, if the error was minor, say a typo, drastic action probably isn't needed. Just take steps to ensure that the correct form and the most up-to-date is used moving forward. But if critical information was incorrect on the form, or if it was omitted entirely. Highly recommend that you move forward with preparing a follow-up sequence to submit that information so that you have a complete application. Don't wait to be asked. Don't wait for it to be requested. An instance where I've commonly see this happen is with the 3674 form. This is required with types of submissions for clinical information, and there are moments where it can get missed. So highly recommend making sure you have that information, and again, follow up to submit it if it was missed. So moving on, outside of FDA forms, a lot of documents in EC submission will require document formatting. A lot of documents are being authored, say for an initial submission, and different formatting needs to happen where a certain font needs to be used, size and setting, and headers need to be generated, and table of contents may need to be included for larger documents. And these are common places where errors can occur, or even a TOC isn't generated at all. So highly recommend for authoring documents, trying to use eCTD templates if possible. This will help make sure that formatting starts off on the right foot and is correct, instead of, say, trying to refer to guidance throughout and trying to sort of recreate the wheel with these templates. So if those are available, highly recommend using. And also bear in mind reusability of the documents. So on my screen now, I have an example of a Module 3 header where the information that pertains to that particular Module 3 document is really the name, manufacturer, eCTD section, and that's the information that's mainly required for the header. But also, the application number, the serial number, and the date are included. Now, that's pertinent information, but it can be found in other and even better places within the submission instead of every Module 3 header. But this is still something that sometimes sponsors feel they want to include. So be mindful of this, because with reusability, while it's not incorrect to include that information, if you do that when preparing, say, an initial IND submission, it might affect how reusable the documents are, say, if that content will be reused for another IND, or if the files will be repurposed later on for another NDA, or another marketing application. So be mindful of what's really needs to be included, and keep in mind any information that you include would need to be updated if that document's reused. So how to resolve if there were issues with the formatting? Well, if any updates to the content of a document are going to be made, this could be a good opportunity to correct those previous formatting errors. Say in a newer version, a table of contents could be included. That would help with navigation. But also, it could be an opportunity to establish consistent standards across applications and even regions. That way, there's consistency between documents to avoid issues from happening, and also in the future, moving forward, that can really help with time saving as well. But last tip, now you probably can't read the text that I have in the cloud here, but the tip is, if you can't read this, a reviewer probably can't either. And I mainly say that to go back to the basics. Outside of all the guidance, if you're looking at a document and you're having trouble looking at the font and you're having trouble navigating, then a reviewer may have trouble too. So keep that in mind. So very related to document formatting and is document granularity. And granularity comes into play when you have multiple eCTD sections that could be a single document or could be split into multiple PDF files. Or say another common issue with granularity might be that a report body, tables, figures, listings, appendices, they're all included in a single very large cumbersome PDF instead of being split into multiple documents and sections. So to make sure you have the right granularity and aren't combining too many things into a single file, it's best to refer to ICH and health authority guidance. So an example I have on my screen is some guidance around Module 2. Now, for example, this table shows that providing a single document for entirety of Module 2 is not accepted, not considered appropriate, but breaking it down into files for Section 2.2, Section 2.3, or even some subsections can be accepted, and this can help with updates in the future or have more granular pieces to work with and publish individually and update individually. Also, consider PDF size when creating and combining files. If you have a very large PDF with a lot of content, it can increase the megabyte size and not be as easy to work with. So it may be better as more granular pieces as a separate PDFs. And also breaking it down can help meet the validation rules. There are limits to how many megabytes of a certain file that a health authority will accept. So for example, EMA requires 200 megabytes or less. So again, say the right granularity wasn't used. Then you have these large documents to work with, or maybe eCTD sections weren't broken down in an ideal way. Well, again, think to the future or for future amendments, how can it be fixed so that there is more granularity with these documents? And with items such as a large report and appendices and TLFs, try to consider splitting at logical breaks. So for example, if you have a file that's way over the megabyte limit, instead of trying to split at say every 100 pages, think would separating the appendices from the report body work, separating out some of the listings, would that work? To make it more logical of what's contained in each file. And also try to be forward thinking again. That's a big part of avoiding these submission mistakes, because when a document's initially being put together, it might seem easiest to write a single 100-page file that covers the different EC sections you have information for. But down the road, if only one small piece of that information gets updated, that 100-page file will have to be fully updated and published and replaced. Whereas if that file had initially been in more granular pieces, you might have a much smaller document that needs to be updated. So again, and want to consider time saving in the future. So moving on when it comes to the documents within these eCTD submissions. Say you have your documents all written, they've been prepared, they've been formatted, and you've tried to avoid as many possible issues and be proactive as you can. There's still some things that can happen within the eCTD submission itself, and some common errors that can happen, particularly with placement. So this could be where, say, the document is submitted in the wrong eCTD section, or even the incorrect metadata has been applied, or at some point the metadata changed. And so, to be proactive, and some checks that you could do to avoid making this type of mistake, and is, say, for reports, verifying that the location matches up with the summary for that section before it's submitted. So this is particularly important, I would say, with initial applications. They might have been worked on continually for months at a time, and say reports were put into the submission and summaries were written, but maybe there were some discussions and placement might have changed a little. Before that final submission is done, and it's a good check to look at where the reports are placed and compare that with the summaries. Even if it's not an initial eCTD submission, say it's a smaller amendment, can verify looking at the information in the cover letter or that's otherwise being submitted to make sure things line up. Another recommendation, and really an important thing to remember, is that for inherited or transferred applications, sometimes these mistakes are unavoidable. Something might have been placed in a section that made sense at the time, but moving forward, it may not be the best section any longer, or maybe the metadata possibly even changed. So I have an example on my screen of a non-clinical report that was submitted and an application that I inherited at some point, where the metadata that was used was rabbit for the species. But looking at the content of the actual report, the species was rats. Now the words are very similar. It's very possible someone was moving quickly, the report was placed in the submission, rabbit was selected instead, but it doesn't exactly match up. So the metadata is incorrect. Also, metadata, if there's a new name, it can necessitate a change in the metadata or make a piece incorrect. This can happen particularly if a CMC manufacturer changes their name. So maybe metadata for that CMC manufacturer was submitted with one name that's no longer correct, and that metadata needs updated. Or even the submission metadata needs to be updated if the sponsor changed their name. So again, not everything can be avoided. So how do we resolve these issues? So once again, consider if the document will be amended in any way. This may be a good opportunity to fix or even move sections if you have to. But definitely consider the level of impact and effort to leave it as is versus making the update. If it was a minor mistake that's not affecting the overall review of the submission application, consider if it's really worth fixing, or if it was so long ago and very minor that it's not really affecting the overall review. It maybe doesn't need to be resubmitted. But if it is affecting your review, or if you're very much not sure and you have a concern, this may be the time to reach out to the regulatory project manager to state your concerns and possibly propose a fix. So once you have that discussion, And if it does need to be fixed, that can be done with a follow-up submission. But it's very important to provide an explanation of what was fixed and why in the cover letter so that it's transparent to everyone looking at the application why that update was made, not only to a reviewer, but possibly to someone who takes over the application in the future. So there's lots of good reason to be very clear about why that update was done. All right, so then talking about documents within the submission, and let's talk about lifecycling. This is something that needs to be done and with ongoing sequences for an application, and very much a place where some issues or errors might happen and during publishing or otherwise. So, an example of an error or issue that could happen: document might have been submitted with the wrong operator. Possibly it was supposed to be replaced, but it was submitted as new, and now there's an issue with that life cycling. Or maybe the previous life cycling was incorrect. Maybe someone who previously put the submission together didn't realize that a certain document should have been replaced, or multiple versions were submitted as new when really they should have been replacing along the way. So a proactive way to look at the application and identify the correct operator is really to check the sequence in the life cycle or the current view of a reviewing tool. This will allow you to see if any previously submitted information was present in that section, and also compare what's available so you make sure if a document is a replace or not. Also, highly recommend using consistent naming for the application so that it's very obvious if something is another version of a document. So in my example, I have in this case, there was a protocol file where there were multiple versions that need to be submitted. And this can often happen with amended versions of a protocol. But each time it was submitted, the name was written differently. So when it came to life cycling, and for someone to know specifically and in an obvious way if the document was new content or say a replace of a previous version, it wasn't super obvious because different naming was being used. So it's easier for these things to be missed. Whereas consistent naming can make it very clear what the document is and what version. And in addition, I want to mention that replacing information is the ideal way to update eCTD sections and amend information. And there is the ability to use the operator append. However, guidance now states that it's recommended to consolidate information and replace the full file instead of trying to append information onto it. So how to resolve if an issue happened with the life cycling? Well, if you have a much older submission application and there's information that's really no longer relevant, wasn't replaced, or was left in the submission, it may be time to consider using the delete operator to remove information that is no longer relevant to the overall application. So this delete would remove the information from the current view of the application for a reviewer. So it's no longer present. But also for information that might be updated or added to, consider the future submission planning. Instead of just updating with the next submission or when it's most convenient, try to look at what is planned for that application. So for the protocol I showed, if there's going to be another amendment to that protocol, it's best to make the updates and any adjustments in the submission that need to be made with that protocol update than to say in a submission where it's an unrelated change of contact or where CMC is being updated instead of the protocol. Try to group it in a way that really overall makes sense versus just the next most convenient sequence. One moment. All right, so I've talked a lot in general about overall submission, documents, placement, and some general items. But one place I want to focus on for the next couple slides is with promotional submissions. And the reason being that more than some other application or submission types, this is an area where my team tends to see a lot of issues. Again, more than some other sequences. So some of these issues are there's an incorrect date or the date format itself is incorrect. The actual form doesn't match the submission structure, or the product label isn't included when it is required for certain types of submissions in section 114.6. And these are just some of the most common ones. There's other issues that occur as well. So a very good way for this particular submission is to compare the 2253 form to the overall sequence before submitting. This type of submission, more than some others, the form very closely matches the metadata and the structure of the actual eCTD, a backbone, and some errors can be caught quickly if these items are compared. So I've circled in particular some items that match with the actual submission structure, but there's other items on this form as well. Also, it's important to investigate any validation errors that come up. This is true for all types of sequences, but particularly with this type of promotional sequence, it can help identify where some of these errors are occurring and really help catch those, say, last moment format corrections and typos. So that's a way to be proactive with these types of submissions. And in particular, or just with anything else, review to be proactive and make the correction in the first place. But also be advised that in my experience with these types of submissions, it may be very necessary that even if you move forward with submitting, it could be rejected if there's an issue. And you could need to go back and revise and resubmit. And again, something seen more commonly with this type of sequence in particular. So while it's important, especially for this one and others, make sure you're reviewing before something's actually sent to the health authority. And possibly consider a checklist of some last minute items, things that may have been completed over the course of the submission, but do a last double check on some of the metadata and other in the structure to make sure everything is correct before it's actually sent. And I'll touch on that in a little later in a few more slides here. Right, so let's say the submission is prepared and documents are done, the sequence is done, and you're ready to submit to a health authority. So for FDA, there is the electronic submission gateway, ESG, that's used to submit. But even at this stage, I think there are more errors that can happen than some of us would like to admit. So it's possible the incorrect center could be chosen. Say CBER is chosen and when it's supposed to go to CDER, Center for Drug Evaluation. They're very close in name. Incorrect submission type could be selected, and it could be the transmission could be duplicated, or there could even be a technical issue while sending. What do you do if your computer freezes or there's some sort of other issue or glitch that happens? And so that's something that can occur, and we'll talk about how to fix that in a moment. But also make sure that you're double checking those drop downs once you've selected the items on the actual ESG page. So a way to double check is check that the center that's been selected matches what's listed on the cover letter. And after you've made your selections, before you click that final send button, just do a quick double check. I had a colleague in the past who went to submit via the gateway, had it all filled out, did the correct drop downs, and at the last moment bumped the little scroll button on his mouse, and it ended up going to the wrong center. So again, things happen. It can't always be avoided. So what to do? If say you accidentally sent in the wrong place, if the computer glitches, how do you know what happened with that? Well, one way is to check the receipt and acknowledgements, see if they were received, also check and make sure to open and those acknowledgements to see if the submission was successful or rejected, and also confirmation of the center that it was directed to. I have up on my screen a rejection, example of a rejection from CDER. And then there's also successful acknowledgements. So not just checking that the receipts were received, but what they say. And be prepared if needed to resubmit it if that's necessary. And if the transmission wasn't successful, or say it didn't go to the correct center. And outside of FDA, with other health agencies, these recommendations are similar. If, say, a sequence was transmitted, but it's not clear if that actual transmission was successful, make sure to check the receipt and acknowledgements. And for the European Medicines Agency, it could be very obvious if something was a success or fail. I very much appreciate how they name their acknowledgements, so it's very clear. But with other health agencies, it's really necessary to fully open the file and check that acknowledgement and to see if it indicates if it was successful, and if it was rejected, if there was a specific validation error or other reason, and that there might have been an issue. And if you're still having problems with the transmission, or say you don't get the receipts and acknowledgements at all, but you feel like the submission went through, or maybe you even tried again, be patient, because those receipts and acknowledgements aren't instantaneous. For a large submission, it could take a few hours to receive them or even more. But don't be too patient, because technical support is available during business hours for these different health agencies. But you have to make sure you're contacting them within the right time frame, especially with us folks like me that work across time zones at different times. And make sure you know who to contact. Sometimes there's a particular email that needs to be used. And in some cases, there's a service desk where an account needs to be created in advance. So proactive measures to make sure you have this instead of being caught off guard or trying to create it on the spot are important. And lastly, something I want to mention and is a final submission checklist. This is an item where even something as simple as what's currently on my screen can really help catch those last final minor issues that can become a nuisance later on. So for example, for the first item on this checklist, it asks, is an application form included? Yes or no? If yes, is it the most current? All right. Has document placement been checked? If so, is it consistent with the content plan and the application form that's being submitted? Or maybe you want to change it to, is it consistent with the summary? So even if it's something similar or something you want to modify, having these last small checks can really help avoid some headaches down the road. So this is my final recommendation to you all. And I very much hope that you have some takeaways from this presentation. And thank you for allowing me to present to you today. We can move on to the Q&A portion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rachel. Got a good number of questions coming in. Okay. Someone would like to know, are both 356H and 2252 forms required for NDA annual reports?
So that's a very good question. We get this a lot. There's a tendency with marketing application NDAs to want to include that 356H form that we're so used to with submissions now require other forms, right? So for annual reports, the 2252, or with promotional submissions to also include that. But really it should be the form that's specified, and don't include that 356H.
Awesome. I hope you're seeing all the hearts and
Thank
claps.
you, everyone.
Yeah, we're feeling the love, audience. Thank you so much. Someone wants to know, what's better, creating multiple source documents and publishing as one document, or publishing as separate documents for 32P2?
I would say there is some debate about this section. It may depend on the actual amount of information you have for that. So, granular pieces, I definitely think are more ideal. But if it truly is a small section and a small amount of information, depending on what your drug development program is, then it may be perfectly fine to combine into single for 32P2.
Excellent. Can you advise on the use of optional attributes in headers?
Oh, as far as new, replace, append. And so I would say typically that's not something that we recommend with the operational attributes. That is metadata that's captured in the structure and doesn't need to be repeated in the document header in that respect.
Great. Typos are somewhat obvious as an example. Beyond that, I feel it can be difficult to agree on what's minor on the submitter side, especially if you're working on a team as opposed to an individual. Do you have guidance on how to determine if something is minor from the perspective of the FDA?
So I think this is one where I want to be careful not to speak for FDA, because this is really their call on what's important to them. So I would say to try to focus on what may be considered as affecting the actual review of the application and possible approval. And if there is a real debate over whether something should be fixed and if it is affecting the review, that probably is the time to reach out to the RPM, that regulatory project manager at the agency, to discuss with them if it's a real concern.
Makes sense. Is it really the case that the caption close to the associated table or figure shouldn't be hyperlinked? And if so, is it mandatory that it can't be hyperlinked?
Could you repeat that one?
Sure. People are asking about hyperlinking. If the caption is close to the associated table or figure, do you hyperlink it? And I guess it's saying, is it mandatory that it can't be hyperlinked? So just the status of hyperlinking and your advice on it.
So let me just add a disclaimer. I'm a very visual person. So without an example, I'm going to try to answer this. So I would say I don't think there are many rules where it says absolutely do not hyperlink any of this. But if, say, there is a footnote that's on the same page as a table, a link wouldn't be needed. So I think assessing if it's actually adding value, that hyperlink within the submission, if it really needs to take you to a significantly different page or area to find that information versus if it's on the same page.
Got a couple more questions, and thankfully it looks like we've got plenty of time to answer them. Is FDA form 3938 released for use when updating a DMF? Does this form replace the cover letter?
So that form definitely should be used. I think for that particular, with regard to replacing the cover letter, I would have to confer a bit with some of my colleagues that work a bit more with the DMF types of submissions, but definitely do want to use that new form. So apologies for that one.
If I have a large section, such as comparability already submitted, do you recommend an addendum to supplement data instead of updating the section? You mentioned before that smaller documents are easier to manage and update.
So smaller documents are definitely easier to, say, update and then republish and replace. I think it depends on what the information that's being added or included. So it is now in guidance that an append should not be used. So adding just pieces on to what was originally submitted. So if it is an update for that main authored section, and the document should be updated and then fully replaced in a new submission, which is part of where the granularity, smaller documents, is helpful in general.
Are there any specific timelines to submit corrections for minor mistakes, such as typo errors, errors in heading, and many, many more? What's the ideal time frame for that?
So as far as a time frame, the truth is that once a sequence is sent to a health authority, it's on their server, and once it's transmitted, it can't be updated without a follow-up sequence, whether it was transmitted yesterday, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. It can't be updated once it's on the health authority server, unless a very extensive process to remove it. But so what would need to happen, regardless of the time frame, is a follow-up sequence. Now, some of what I mentioned earlier is if there is a typo that's really not affecting review. I've seen typos say where it was a report that's not necessarily as relevant anymore, wasn't affecting review, so the sponsor decided to let it go. It really has to be a judgment call, unfortunately.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you have a submission lifecycle that needs to be cleaned, for example, multiple submission of a protocol as opposed to replacing the protocol with each submission, how do you think what's the best way of updating these sections that need to be deleted and replaced by a final document or the most up-to-date document? Do we submit a new submission as a replacement or ask to delete the multiple other examples?
Well, first and foremost, with any life cycling issues, it's important to make sure that the most current version is available to the reviewer and that that's correctly placed and present within the submission and within the application. As far as the older life cycling thing, it could be necessary to clean it up. If there was only a minor issue, maybe, and you're still referring sometimes to that information, you may want to leave it. But to remove the information from the current view entirely, the really only option is to, outside of replacing with a newer version, is to use that delete operator, which will take it out of the current view. Now, that said, the information is always available in previous sequences for that application. That information isn't, say, fully deleted. It just goes out of the current view of what the current information is for an application. So I wanted to clarify that because I know there's some confusion around the delete operator. Again, it removes it from the current view.
Got it. Got a couple more questions. I think we can probably get through them. Do you have any advice on how to document a submission error when it's not major enough to re-warrant resubmission or notification to a regulatory agency? For example, there's an incorrect year on file name, but the date within the file is correct.
I think that I guess it would depend in my mind on what that's being documented for. Is it a note internally, or is it a note for a future update, which is, I think, what I've seen most often is if an error can't be fixed in the moment or it gets missed but then identified, that information tends to be noted so that whenever there is a future amendment, I've seen this several times with protocols, that when there is a future amendment, that typo will be corrected. And so I think it may depend on what it's for.
Got it. A few more questions I think we can get to. Do we include all related sequences in an EMA cover letter during responses to queries, or only the latest eCTD sequence number, or will only providing the latest eCTD sequence number suffice? For example, we have a number of related sequences like 0013, 0014, et cetera. Would you prefer to include only or all of these sequences, or only the latest single initial related sequence?
I think that one might be a little bit of a judgment call without me knowing the program and the exact thing there. So you definitely want to reference the related information. I don't know if there would be necessarily an issue with including that additional information of the other related sequences as so fortunately, that may be a bit of a judgment call there with that one.
Got it. I understand. Do you have a best practice that you recommend for correcting an STF name? If the protocol name changes, do you update the STF name as well? We've always left our STF names as unchangeable, but we find more and more that we need to change them.
Yeah, in terms of that area, I think it could depend on just how different the name is. If the previous information that we used is still applicable, but maybe not a 100% match, it could very well be fine to leave as is. But if there is a reason that it's changed significantly, and again, going back to the review, now it's causing issue in navigation or the review of the complete application, and then it may be necessary to fix. And I would say try to incorporate that if there's another amendment or update, but may depend.
Great. Looks like we got 2 more questions, then we'll need to wrap it up. For non-clinical reports being built in Module 4, is it absolutely required that they're built in a specific order? For example, in vitro first, followed by in vivo. Also for tox reports, in order by species, route of administration, and duration.
So definitely some best practice items there for that. Is it a critical issue? If they're not, probably not. You'd have to, again, get FDA's take on that, but definitely best practice to try for ordering correctly.
Got it. Okay. Looks like there's one last question. What keep coming in. and Rachel, you're doing an amazing job answering these, so thank you so much. To reiterate, the related sequence was referenced in the cover letter. There was just no related sequence identified in the XML. Is that okay since it's in the cover letter, or is an update needed to the XML to add the related sequence?
So ideally, the cover letter and the structure should match, and it should correspond to each other, right? If there's something related in the cover, it should be found in the submission structure and in that respect. If it's something that was already submitted, then it becomes more of that judgment call of, is it affecting the review or not? And so definitely some gray area.
Yeah, sure sounds like it. Got one last question, and then we're going to hand it back to Robin to wrap it up. But these questions have been amazing. The audience has really put a lot of thought into this. If an IND is transferred from CRO A to CRO B for IND maintenance purpose, does the company B need to import all the historical eCTD sequences into their system to help submit the future submissions? Is this step required, or is it just a best practice?
I would say very, very strongly recommended for that. It is technically possible to submit sequences without all of the previous information. However, without those previous sequences, it's not necessarily possible to stay consistent, to preserve the life cycling, because those previous submissions are needed for applying replace and delete type operators, and for keeping with the same metadata. So, again, very strongly recommend, if possible, having those previous sequences.
Sounds like some great advice. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for that amazing presentation. I'm loving seeing all the hearts and claps and thumbs up. And thank you so much to our audience. You guys have been amazing. And thank you so much to RAPS for partnering with us and allowing us to present on this topic today. And I'm going to hand it back over to Robin to take us out.